It's a basic part of our humanity for Christians, for people of all faiths and all religions, not just across the Middle East, but across the world.
That is the end of the statement on Iran. I'll give the few... A point of order, Mark Richard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I seek your guidance. Since Christmas, hundreds of my constituents have not received a single letter via the Royal Mail. This is causing huge anxiety for those waiting for medical results, important documentation, job offers, etc. The local post office team, postmen and women, have said this is a result of management decisions at the most senior level. What advice can you give me to pass on to my constituents the possibility of the Minister for the Royal Mail and Postal Services coming to the House to make an urgent statement to ensure that this is thoroughly and fully investigated and those letters begin to land on doormats once again in Shropshire?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving notice that he intended to draw attention to this matter. As he knows, this is not actually a point of order, but he is an experienced member who serves on the panel of chairs, and he does not need any guidance from the chair on how to take this matter further. No doubt he'll be pursuing it. And also, the Treasury front bench would have heard his request for a statement or a response from the appropriate minister. Point of order, Richard Holden. Is it a short point of order, Richard Holden?
Always, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, the Cabinet Office Guide to Parliamentary Work is clear that there should be no inconsistencies between information provided in answers to written questions and information released under the Freedom of Information Act, and that material disclosable under Freedom of Information should also be disclosed to Parliament. On the 2nd and 4th of December in WPQs, I asked the Secretary of State for Transport what information the DVLA hold about third-party intermediary organisations acting on behalf of Oxford City Council and Oxfordshire County Council in accessing vehicle keeper data. In both cases, the Minister for Local Transport told me that this information was not appropriate to disclose because of commercial sensitivities. However, shortly afterwards, the DVLA released under FOI the CODA contract with Oxfordshire County Council confirming contractual arrangements involving intermediaries and third-party access, with only personal data redacted. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd be grateful for your guidance on this apparent inconsistency and whether you might raise it with the Leader of the House or departments concerned.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of his point of order. I take it that he has informed the honourable member for Wakefield and Rothwell that he intended to raise the matter in the House and is nodding accordingly. As the honourable member knows, the Chair is not responsible for the accuracy of ministerial answers, if only we were. But I'm sure the table office will be able to advise him on how he might pursue the matter further. And once again, no doubt the Treasury front bench have made a note and will be passing that information on directly to the Minister involved. If that is the end of the point of orders, I'll give the front benches a few moments to shuffle over. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Wes Streeting. Which Minister is nodding?
Medical Training Prioritisation Bill.
Second reading what day? Tomorrow. Are we sure?
Yes.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill Kirsty Blackman. Not. Oh, you're here. Marvellous. Good.
Removal of Peerages Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 13th of March.
Friday the 13th of March. Now we go on to the 10-minute rule motion. Emergency and life-saving skills schools. Dr Neil Shastrihar.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the teaching in schools of skills relating to emergency situations, including life-saving skills, and for connected purposes. The Emergency and Life-Saving Skills Schools Bill seeks to ensure that every child leaving school possesses the knowledge and skills to respond effectively in emergencies, including life-threatening situations. It is a bill about equipping young people with capabilities that matter beyond the classroom, skills that can preserve life and, in certain circumstances, protect communities. Every year, Madam Deputy Speaker, thousands of people in England find themselves at the centre of sudden, chaotic emergencies. a child at the roadside following a road traffic collision, a victim of knife crime bleeding out, a medical emergency unfolding whilst onlookers wait for an ambulance, watching as precious minutes slip away. All they want to do is help, but too many do not know how. Not infrequently, the question asked afterwards is not what went wrong, but why no one present knew what to do. Most emergencies don't happen in hospitals. They happen in our homes, they happen on our streets, and they happen on our roadsides. It's in those first critical moments before professional help arrives, outcomes are often determined, not by advanced medicine, but by whether those present can recognise what is happening, act decisively, and summon help effectively. Evidence consistently shows that early recognition and rapid intervention saves lives. Delay, confusion, or failure to communicate accurately with the emergency services can be fatal. And yet, despite this, our education system still leaves too much to chance. At present, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether a young person is taught how to recognise an emergency, how to remain calm under pressure, how to summon help accurately, or how to apply basic life-saving interventions depends largely on postcode, school discretion, or family circumstance. Some pupils do receive this knowledge, many do not. There is simply no guarantee. This is not a criticism, Madam Deputy Speaker, of our schools or our teachers, who already shoulder enormous responsibility. It is simply a recognition that we have not set a clear national expectation that these skills matter. This bill seeks to close that gap. It is built around three core aims. First, to ensure that pupils can recognise emergency situations quickly and accurately. The difference between an accident and an emergency is not always obvious, particularly under pressure. Training pupils to assess severity, identify immediate danger, and understand when urgent action is required is foundational to this. Second, to prioritise effective summoning of emergency assistance. Knowing how to contact the emergency services, what information to provide, how to remain calm, and how to follow instructions given by call handlers is not always instinctive, and it must be taught. Clear communication saves time, and time saves lives. Third, to ensure that pupils receive practical, hands-on instruction in the most critical life-saving interventions, with particular emphasis on the management of catastrophic bleeding. Uncontrolled hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of preventable death in trauma. Pupils should learn how to identify severe bleeding, apply direct pressure, use tourniquets where appropriate, and act decisively to stabilise the casualty whilst prioritising their own safety. This should include, of course, formal stop the bleed training. These life-saving skills are not confined, of course, to domestic accidents. In mass casualty situations, such as terrorist-style attacks, rapid recognition of danger, safe decision-making, and early bleeding control can save multiple lives before emergency services arrive. What is equally important is that pupils should be trained to assess the risk for themselves, to avoid secondary harm, and to act only when it's safe to do so. This is, of course, not about encouraging recklessness, but about fostering informed, disciplined action. And the importance of this cannot be overstated. In emergencies, well-intentioned but untrained bystanders can inadvertently worsen outcomes or place themselves in danger. The training that is envisaged under this bill should instil practical resilience, knowing when to act, how to act, and when not to act. Evidence shows that repeated practice and realistic simulations significantly improve retention and the likelihood of effective intervention under pressure. The objectives of this bill are reinforced by the works of organisations such as Citizen Aid, which has led the way in educating young people on safe responses to major incidents. Citizen Aid was founded by two of my former bosses, Professor Sir Keith Porter and Major General Tim Hodgetts, and I had the pleasure of hosting them to do a drop-in event in Parliament last year. Its programmes demonstrate that pupils can learn to recognise threats, manage catastrophic bleeding, communicate effectively, and act without panic. Their work shows that structured training builds both competence and confidence, particularly in high-stress scenarios. This is not about turning children into paramedics. It's not about overloading the curriculum. It's not about replacing professional emergency services. It is about ensuring that every young person leaves school equipped with a core set of practical, age-appropriate skills, how to recognise an emergency, how to respond safely, and how to communicate clearly with the emergency services. And critically, how to provide basic life-saving assistance until help arrives. This is because preparedness is not a niche concern, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a matter of resilience. One day, any one of us here may depend upon not upon a professional, but on a passerby. That passerby may be a young person standing there, willing and wanting to help, but uncertain what to do in the circumstances. That uncertainty should not be inevitable. Importantly, this bill is not proposing radical change. Many countries already include emergency response skills within their education system. Here at home, we teach elements of first aid and health and safety in different ways, but we lack consistency, and without the assurance that every child will receive that education. Concerns about pressure on the school curriculum are understandable, but this bill doesn't seek to require wholesale reform, nor does it seek to impose excessive burdens. Training can be delivered through a combination of classroom teaching, practical workshops and simulations. All of these can be supported by qualified instructors, the emergency services and voluntary organisations. The focus must be on gaining those essential high-impact skills. The intent behind this bill reflects a broader societal responsibility. It's not about ideology, it simply recognises that preserving life is a fundamental public good. Pupils trained in these skills will carry them into their families, their workplaces and communities, and thereby have a multiplying effect. In doing so, schools will be directly contributing to national resilience and public safety. What this bill proposes is clarity and coherence, a national expectation that life-saving knowledge is a fundamental part of the curriculum as much as literacy or numeracy when it comes to preparing young people for the real world. International experience reinforces this argument. Countries that embed emergency response training in schools see higher levels of bystander intervention, improved survival rates and greater public confidence. It also reflects a broader truth, that resilience begins long before a crisis occurs. It is built through education, confidence and preparation. By equipping young people with these skills, we do not only improve outcomes in emergencies, we foster responsibility, calm decision-making and a willingness to act for others. This bill is deliberately rooted in prevention rather than reaction, in empowerment rather than fear. Of course, no legislation can prevent every tragedy, but we can ensure that when emergencies do happen, as they inevitably will, the people closest are not left powerless. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill does not ask the House to make a dramatic leap in policy. It asks us to take a sensible, proportionate step to ensure that our education system reflects the realities of the world our young people will face. For the hardest burden of any of us to carry is not that we tried and failed, but that a life was lost whilst we stood by, not through indifference, but through the absence of knowledge this House could have chosen to provide.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
John Cooper, Lincoln Jopp, Charlie Dewhurst, Blake Stevenson, Bradley Thomas, Jim Shannon and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Dr Neil Shastri Hurst.
Go on. Show that down. Here we go. God, that's good. Very smooth.
Emergency and Life-Saving Skills Schools Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 29th of May 2026.
Friday the 29th of May 2026.
Well done.
Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Finance Number 2 Bill Committee.
Now.
Order. Under the order of the House of the 16th of December, we shall now move to Committee of the Whole House. Order.
Finance number 2 bill, clauses 63 to 68, clauses 83 to 85 and schedule 13, clause 86, and any new clauses or new schedules relating to the subject matter of those clauses and that schedule.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker, but please use our names when addressing the Chair. Madam Chair, Chair and Madam Chairman are also acceptable. We will start with the group on inheritance tax on pension interests, and we begin with clause 63, stand part, with which it will be convenient to consider the clauses stand part and new clauses on the selection paper. The question is that clause 63 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister, Lucy Rigby.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to open this second day of Finance Bill Committee stage debates. Yesterday, my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, set out how this bill gives effect to a budget that took fair and responsible decisions to stabilise and strengthen the public finances, address the cost of living and renew our public services. We're clear, Madam Chair, that we will not repeat mistakes of the last government. That means no return to austerity and no completely irresponsible, unfunded spending commitments either, each of which, unfortunately, were features of the party opposite's time in power. This government wholeheartedly rejects those failed approaches, and we instead choose a different path, one of fiscal responsibility and one which will strengthen our economy so that it delivers for people right across this country. Today, the House will consider a further set of important and targeted measures relating to pensions, gambling duties and alcohol duty, which reflect this government's commitment to a tax system that's fair, modern and aligned with the realities of today's economy. Our approach to changes to gambling taxation are, as we'll come to later on this afternoon, fair and proportionate, and as my right honourable friend the Chancellor set out in her budget, our reforms to gambling taxation will significantly contribute to this government's efforts to lift an additional 450,000 children out of poverty. On pensions, the clauses before the House ensure that generous tax reliefs continue to support pensions' core purpose, that is, helping people save for retirement. They address long-standing inconsistencies and ensure that pensions are not used primarily as a vehicle for passing on wealth free of inheritance tax, but instead continue to project the vast majority of estates and maintain strong incentives to save. Madam Chair, I'll turn now to clauses 63 to 68. Pensions enjoy significant tax benefits, with gross income tax and national insurance contributions relief costing £78.2 billion in 2023-24. It's therefore crucial to ensure that these reliefs are being used for their intended purpose, which is to encourage saving for retirement and later life. Changes to pensions tax policy over the last decade by the previous government led to pensions being used and increasingly marketed as tax planning vehicles to transfer wealth rather than holding true to pensions' primary purpose, which is, of course, providing a way to fund retirement. As honourable members will know, there are also long-standing inconsistencies in the inheritance tax treatment of different types of pensions. Most UK-registered pension schemes are discretionary, meaning members are able to nominate who they would like to receive any death benefits, but the scheme trustees are not obliged to follow members' wishes. Under existing rules, any unused pension funds and death benefits from discretionary schemes are not subject to inheritance tax. By contrast, there are some pension schemes that are non-discretionary, and these are subject to inheritance tax under existing rules. Madam Chair, the changes made by Clause 63 mean that most unused pension funds and death benefits payable from a pension will form part of a person's estate for inheritance tax purposes from the 6th of April 2027. Clause 64 ensures that personal representatives are responsible for paying any inheritance tax due. Clause 65 means personal representatives will be able to request that the pension scheme administrator withholds paying a proportion of benefits where certain conditions are met. It also allows both personal representatives and pension beneficiaries to make pension scheme administrators pay inheritance tax due on pensions directly to HMRC, again provided certain conditions are met. Clause 64 makes some consequential amendments to the Inheritance Tax Act 1984 to ensure that the existing exemption for spouses and civil partners and the treatment of payments to charities continue to apply. Clause 67 changes the income tax rules for pensions to provide for the payment of inheritance tax, including in respect of direct payment by pension schemes. And Clause 68 ensures that the changes take effect from the 6th of April 2027. Madam Chair, these clauses ensure that pensions are used, as I said, for their core intended purpose rather than as a vehicle for passing on wealth free of inheritance tax. These clauses also remove long-standing inconsistencies and deliver on the government's promise to this country to build a stronger and a fairer economy.
Shadow Minister James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I wish to speak on behalf of His Majesty's opposition to new clauses 22, 23 and 24, tabled in my name and those of my honourable friends. And as the Minister set out, clause 63 to 68 introduced measures to apply inheritance tax to unspent pension assets and other death benefits for deaths occurring after the 6th of April 2027. Madam Chair, this Labour government has taken taxes to record levels, £26 billion in additional taxes in this budget, £66 billion since the election, tax increases that were not mentioned in their manifesto. And Labour is increasing taxes on family businesses, on farms, on jobs, on dividends, on savings, on motorists, and now death. Removing the inheritance tax exemption for pensions could undermine efforts to encourage people to save at a time when people aren't saving enough. And what does the government do? They limit the salary sacrifice pensions contribution scheme and introduce a new raid on people's pensions pots. The Minister didn't refer to the impact assessment, but it is worth pointing out that it estimates that 10,500 estates will now become liable for inheritance tax, raising £1.5 billion by 2029. And 38,500 estates will pay more inheritance tax than previously was the case. And that's why we oppose this extension of inheritance tax. And the underlying principle, which the Minister seemed to allude to, that people's money doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the state. New Clause 22 is straightforward. It requires the Chancellor to set out the impact of these measures on pension saving, household saving decisions and on personal representatives. There is real concern, I'm surprised the Minister didn't address this, about the administrative burden that is being placed on personal representatives and the effect on the industry. Personal representatives will be required to identify every pension asset, to calculate the inheritance tax due and ensure payment within 6 months. And they will be personally liable if they fail to settle all the liabilities that are due. In many cases, that deadline will be impossible to meet and it must be extended. Furthermore, if a pension fund has to sell illiquid assets, such as commercial property, quickly, it may well not get the full market value. But the bill does not introduce a relief where the underlying assets must be sold and the proceeds were less than the value of the assets at the time of death. Late payments will attract interest at 8%. By contrast, someone in self-assessment has 10 months to pay tax on the income they already understand. Both the Association of Taxation Technicians and the Chartered Institute have offered some practical solutions. Firstly, to extend the withholding periods, personal representatives can ask pension administrators to withhold 50% of funds for up to 15 months. But that's simply not long enough for the complex cases I've referred to, particularly where business property valuations have to be agreed with the HMRC. Will the Minister consider allowing HMRC to extend withholding in such complex cases? Second, they should allow instalment payments for illiquid pension assets. Billions of pounds of pension wealth are in these illiquid assets. The government allows inheritance tax to be paid over 10 years for illiquid estate assets. Why deny the same practical relief for pensions? When this policy was announced, the OBR gave it a very high uncertainty rating and estimated behavioural effects will cut the static yield by around 43%. So the government's own forecasters accept these changes may well significantly alter saving behaviour, and the new clause simply requires the Chancellor to assess that impact and come to the House to make it clear. New clause 23 requires the Chancellor to consult on the impact of sections 63 to 67 and whether they deliver better outcomes for savers and pensioners. The truth is the government rushed this consultation out after the 2024 budget and followed it with a very narrow technical consultation, which did not consider the principled question of whether this approach to pensions being brought with inheritance tax framework at all was appropriate. As the Investing and Savings Alliance told the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee in their inquiry, which the Exchequer Secretary gave evidence to, they said if we were consulted and listened to, we'd probably not be having this discussion today, because I do not think pensions will be going into IHT. And both the Chartered Institute and ATT have criticised the government for consulting on pensions in isolation rather in the context of individuals' wider inheritance tax position. So our clause is explicit. Consultation must take place to assess whether these changes deliver better outcomes for savers and pensions, wording which reflects the commitment the Labour Party made in their manifesto. Our third new clause 24, is essential. It would require the HMRC to publish comprehensive guidance on the new rules for pensions and to set up a dedicated helpline. And why does this matter? Because this measure will be incredibly complex in practice. The Chartered Institute has said that professional executors are already questioning whether they can continue to operate in the market at all. Some firms, we're told, are already leaving the market. And if professionals step back, the burden falls on lay personal representatives, often grieving family members or friends, with more errors, delay and potentially a wider tax gate ensuing. Professional indemnity insurers also need clarity. Yet when is the HMRC due to deliver detailed guidance? Not until spring 2027, just weeks before these changes take effect. That is completely outrageous and far too late, and that's why this clause would require guidance to be published within 6 months of this Act being passed. I want to touch on a broader concern which has been raised with me around the serious unintended consequences potentially for unmarried couples. While today couples can anticipate making financial provision for each other via pensions, if this measure comes into force, they will have to look at other options. If one member of an unmarried couple in their 50s or 60s dies with a pension at peak value, the survivor could lose up to 40% of that fund. Are ministers talking to pension scheme administrators to mitigate the risks for such couples and to provide clear guidance? Madam Chair, these clauses increase taxes, they add complexity, they penalise saving and they add stress for grieving families. Despite clause 67, we're also advised there's still a risk of double taxation of inheritance tax and income tax, which could see beneficiaries paying an effective rate of 67%. So our amendments seek to mitigate its worst impacts, and the Chancellor should assess the real impact on saving behaviour and personal representatives. She should consult properly on these provisions, and she must provide clear guidance backed by dedicated support. We should be incentivising saving, encouraging people to do the right thing. Extending inheritance tax does the opposite, and we will oppose these measures tonight.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a retrospective tax without transitional protection. It upends plans for those who have already made sacrifices to build up their pensions, undermines confidence in pensions planning, reduces long-term investment and causes people to rush to withdraw money from their pensions too. As has been mentioned already, the Chartered Institute and ATT have raised concerns about these clauses which are shoehorning pensions legislation into tax legislation. There are major worries about creating personal liability without control for personal representatives, whether executors or administrators. Personal representatives, as we've heard, are legally obligated to gather all the assets, settle any liabilities, including inheritance tax, and distribute the remainder of the estate to the beneficiaries. They are personally liable if they do not set aside enough money to settle all financial liabilities, including IHT. Experts have warned that being personally liable for IHT on a pension fund that never comes into their hands leaves the door open to costly and protracted litigation and will understandably make personal representatives, such as professionals or friends of the deceased, much more cautious before they distribute all of the estate. Even more concerning is the fact that if representatives discover a new pension fund after settling the initial IHT liability, this will have a knock-on effect not only on the estate, but on all other pension funds. It means that IHT will have to be recalculated for every part of the estate and every pension fund. It is far from uncommon for people to have had different jobs with separate pension plans, so the risk of miscalculation is obvious. If someone passes away before they've had the chance to consolidate their pension funds, tracking down these unused pots within 6 months of their death will be very difficult for executors and will mean that the initial IHT calculations could be wrong. The government must recognise and amend this. If it doesn't, and ministers simply ask future executors to sign some sort of disclaimer form, the government will soon find that nobody will want to take on that role. Our amendments in new clauses 18, 19 and 20 raise the clear need for significant reforms and are a means of pressing the government to protect individuals from being liable for private pensions they didn't know about and couldn't reasonably know about either. Finally, Madam Chair, there is widespread worry that family members might have to wait up to 15 months before they are able to access their inheritance during what is bound to be a hugely straining period of loss and grief. Our proposed NC20 urges the government to recognise that reality and take steps to address it.
Minister.
Madam Chair, thank you. And let me begin by thanking honourable members for their contributions to today's debate on these clauses. And I will respond to each of the specific points that have been raised, but I want to first reflect briefly again on what I set out at the outset as being the core purpose of this bill. This bill contains fair and necessary reforms to the tax system, which unfortunately have been ducked for far too long. They will help to strengthen our economy for the long term, ensuring that we can cut the cost of living and inflation, restore our public services to health, and restore the public finances to health too. And the Tories and Reform, who indeed are increasingly indistinguishable, it might be said, have already set out their choice, a return to the chaos and indeed to the instability of the past as well. That approach failed before and we're not going back. The clauses we've debated today restore pensions, as I said, to their core and intended purpose, which is funding retirement, not allowing them to function as a tax-free vehicle for the transfer of wealth. And generous tax relief for retirement saving is preserved. The clauses presented today ensure that pension wealth is treated fairly and consistently for inheritance tax purposes. They protect ordinary families with more than 90% of estates still paying no inheritance tax at all each year after these changes. Madam Chair, I'll now turn to the non-government amendments tabled for this session. And new clause 18 would require the Treasury to review the effects of the changes to pension tax policy, including their impacts on individuals, administrators and behaviour. A report would need to be laid in Parliament no later than 6 months from the date that the clauses come into force. Madam Chair, this amendment is not necessary. The Government has published a tax information and impact note in the normal way on these changes, and this sets out the impact on individuals, households and families, and it also accounts for the impact on personal representatives too. The Government also, as honourable members know, keep all tax policies under review through the monitoring of returns and communication with representative bodies and taxpayer groups. A review within 6 months of the policy taking effect on the 6th of April 2027 is not practical, not least because the data relating to inheritance tax in 2027-28 will not be fully available until the summer of 2030. This is the normal timescale and operates because tax liabilities data is only available with a long lag, including because the filing of the relevant inheritance tax accounts is due 12 months after a death. And for those reasons, Madam Chair, I therefore move that new clause 18 should be rejected. Madam Chair, I'll now turn to new clause 19, which would require the Government to report on the impact of the reforms on personal representatives. This would include the personal liability for tax on pension assets outside of the estate and any practical difficulties of identifying and valuing multiple pension arrangements within existing time limits. These changes that this bill brings about are consistent with the process which already exists for administering estates and paying any tax due. Personal representatives are already responsible for administering the rest of the estate, including non-discretionary pension schemes, which are already, as I said, within the scope of inheritance tax. The Government has acknowledged that there are some challenges for personal representatives, and the changes announced at budget mitigate the risks to personal representatives by providing them with the ability to direct pension scheme administrators to withhold taxable benefits for up to 15 months from the date of death, and indeed to direct them to make payments of inheritance tax directly to HMRC. This will, of course, not apply to pension benefits which are exempt from inheritance tax, including those being left to a spouse or civil partner, pension funds under £1,000 and continuing annuities. The Government will also publish regulations this year to provide the right framework to allow personal representatives and pension schemes to exchange all of the necessary information for inheritance tax purposes. The changes announced at Budget 25 also protect personal representatives from the risk that pension pots emerge later. And for these reasons, Madam Chair, new Clause 19 is not necessary and should therefore be rejected. Madam Chair, new Clause 20 would require the Government to review the tax administration arrangements relating to inherited pension pots with a focus on any delays in the payment of inherited pension pots caused by tax administration processes. HMRC would be required to publish the outcome of the review within 12 months of the passing of this Act. The Government does not want payments to pension beneficiaries to be delayed unnecessarily, and in the vast majority of cases, payments will be made as soon as pension schemes have completed their discretionary processes. Pension benefits that are exempt from inheritance tax, such as payments to spouses and civil partners, or death in service payments, can still be paid as soon as the pension scheme is ready to pay. We do, of course, need to strike a fair balance between beneficiaries of the pension and of the wider estate. And that's exactly why we announced that personal representatives will be able to direct pension schemes to withhold 50% of the taxable benefits for up to 15 months if they reasonably expect inheritance tax to be due. Pension beneficiaries will therefore still be able to access 50% of their taxable pension benefits as soon as their pension scheme is ready to pay, and the remainder once the inheritance tax on the pension has been paid or indeed the notice to withhold has been withdrawn. And as I've set out, to ensure that the process of calculating, reporting and paying inheritance tax does not take any longer than necessary, the Government will introduce regulations setting out deadlines for the parties involved to exchange information. New Clause 20, Madam Chair, should therefore be rejected. Moving to new Clause 22, this would require the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement on the effects of the policy on pension saving levels, household saving decisions and personal representatives, and this statement would need to be made within 6 months of the Act being passed. It's very important to emphasise that the intended purpose of pension savings, and indeed one that this Government wholly supports, is to fund retirement, and that is why, to address the Shadow Exchequer Secretary's point, we continue to incentivise pension savings with tax relief on both contributions to pensions and the growth of funds held within a pension scheme. And those reliefs totalled £78.2 billion in 2023-24. Estates will continue to benefit from the normal nil rate bands, reliefs and exemptions available. For example, the nil rate bands mean an estate can pass on up to £1 million with no inheritance tax liability, and the general rules mean any transfers, including the payments of death benefits to a spouse or civil partner, are fully exempt from inheritance tax. Madam Chair, as I said, 90% of UK estates will continue to have no inheritance tax liability whatsoever following these changes, and the reforms will only affect a minority with inheritable pension wealth. New Clause 22, Madam Chair, should therefore be rejected. Moving now to new Clause 23, which would require the Chancellor of the Exchequer to undertake a consultation before the 6th of April 2027 on the potential impacts of these changes. The consultation would consider the extent to which the changes to inheritance tax on pension interest deliver better outcomes for UK savers and pensioners. The Government did indeed launch a technical consultation on the day of autumn budget 2024, following the announcement of the policy to draw on the expertise of tax, legal and pension industries. That technical consultation was focused on the processes required to implement the changes, and the Government has made changes as a result of that consultation. As well as the technical consultation on these changes, there's been extensive and regular engagement with stakeholders from both the pensions industry and legal and tax representatives too. And I note the praise for HMRC officials from witnesses at the Economic Affairs Finance Bill Subcommittee in the other place as to how they've engaged on these issues over the course of the last year. Madam Chair, the policy problem with the inheritance tax treatment of pensions is well understood, and we need to ensure that pensions continue to be used, as I said, for their core purpose, which is funding retirement, and that tax reliefs are directed to that effect. And as I've set out, Madam Chair, pensions will continue to enjoy significant tax benefits. For those reasons, new Clause 23 should be rejected. Turning lastly Madam Chair, to new clause 24, which would require HMRC to publish comprehensive guidance on the implementation of the policy within 6 months of the Act being passed. It also requires that HMRC establish a dedicated helpline for inquiries relating to inheritance tax on pension interests. As I've set out, Madam Chair, comprehensive guidance will be published in advance of April 2027, and HMRC will provide interactive tools to support personal representatives. Publishing guidance when policies go live is, of course, established practice and ensures that guidance is fully up to date when made available. However, HMRC will continue to work with industry on shaping this guidance and ensuring that the reforms are fully understood. People will be able to call the inheritance tax helpline for inquiries related to these reforms, and as you would expect, staff will be fully trained on each of these changes such that they can support customers. It's on this basis, Madam Chair, that new clause 24 should also be rejected. And Madam Chair, with these clauses, generous tax relief for retirement saving is preserved. I therefore urge the House to reject new clauses 18 to 20 and new clauses 20 to 24, and I beg to move that clauses 63 to 68 stand part of this bill.
The question is that clause 63 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobby. Is that clause 63 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Mark Ferguson and Taiwo Owatemi. The tellers for the noes, Lincoln Jopp and Alicia Kearns.
The ayes to the right, 348. The noes to the left, 167.
The ayes to the right were 348. The noes to the left, 167. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Thank you. With the leave of the House, I shall put together the questions that clauses 64 to 68 stand part of the bill. The question is that clauses 64 to 68 stand part of the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. New clause 24 has been selected for a separate decision. I call James Wilde to move the new clause 24 formally.
HMRC guidance on inheritance tax on pension interests.
The question is that new clause 24 be read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby. The question is that new clause 24 be read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Lincoln Jott and Alicia Kearns. The tellers for the noes, Mark Ferguson and Taiwo Owatemi.
Thank you.